This is an American warship, the USS Pueblo. By itself, it's fairly unremarkable, a tiny converted cargo ship from the Second World War. America's really good at preserving its maritime history. There are some insanely impressive museum ships all over the place, like the USS Olympia and the battleship New Jersey and Philly, and the USS Constitution over in Charleston, Massachusetts. But to visit Pueblo, you'll have to take a little trip out east. A few thousand miles out east to North Korea. Pueblo is moored at a pier in Pyongyang, the capital, at a venue called the Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum. Once upon a time, Pueblo, the humble little 345-ton, 177-foot-long tin can, became the centerpiece of one of the Cold War's most dramatic moments. A crisis that raised the temperature at a time when massive world powers anxiously eyed one another with their fingers on nuclear buttons. Just how Pueblo came to be moored here in North Korea is one of the great dramatic tales of Cold War espionage that's since entered legend. The unlikely story of an American spy ship taken intact by a technologically inferior enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, I am your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the incredible true story of the capture of USS Pueblo. January 1968. The Cold War is in full swing. Tensions are high. For nearly 20 years now, the Soviet Union has been building up a nuclear arsenal to rival the United States. But instead of open conflict and the inevitable nuclear Armageddon, wars are fought by proxy. First was Korea, when the US Army rushed to back the democratic South while communist Chinese troops flooded in from the north to drive them back to the sea. An uneasy ceasefire saw the country divided into two. By 1968, it was happening again at Vietnam. US forces, with their overwhelming air superiority, were still faced with a brutal war of attrition, fighting an enemy that knew their country very well. Unbeknownst to the US and South Vietnamese forces that January, North Vietnamese troops are finalizing preparations for an immense assault that will bring the fight to the streets of Saigon. Asia is a powder keg that threatens to set off the nuclear conflict all sides have been dreading. It's in the US's best interests to monitor the situation, but it's a vast front. Soviet and Chinese military activity spans thousands of miles from the Sea of Japan in the north all the way down to the South China and West Philippines Sea. Enter USS Pueblo, a technical research vessel officially, in truth, a well-equipped spy ship. Pueblo had begun life as a small cargo ship built in Wisconsin back in 1944, constructed as a standard freight supply vessel for the US Navy, named FS-344, but she found work instead as an armed training ship for the Coast Guard. By the mid-60s, the US Navy had found that small vessels just like FS-344 made for good surveillance craft. They were tiny and nimble, able to monitor from afar and leave virtually no footprint. FS-344 was recommissioned after a period of layup in 1966 and renamed Pueblo after a county in Colorado. To become a proper spy ship though, Pueblo would need to undergo some serious modifications. She was put under the command of Captain Lloyd M. Booker, a veteran submariner who'd always dreamed of commanding his own boat. Unfortunately for him, the switch from diesel-electric to nuclear subs had killed his command prospects, and he was given Pueblo instead. The orders came, he said later, as a painful turning point in my career. Unhappy at the new appointment, Booker still set about overseeing the little ship's overhaul at Bremerton in 1967. But off the bat, Pueblo and her skipper were put at a huge disadvantage. US defense spending was being sunk into the Vietnam War at an alarming rate. 1965 had seen the US spend about $54 billion, upped to a staggering $78 billion just 2 years later. At the time Pueblo was being converted, seemingly countless fortunes were being spent on sustained aerial bombing campaigns and troop movements on the ground. At sea, things were different. The Navy focused on their carriers and their destroyers. Pueblo and her mission were not a priority. The surveillance equipment alone came in at over $1.5 million. Its cost delayed Pueblo's conversion all by itself. After that, there was hardly anything left to finish her off, and it would have drastic consequences. For one thing, spy ships need to have contingency plans in case of capture. The crew need to be able to scuttle their ship quickly and easily, destroying delicate spy documents and their equipment at the same time. Pueblo got none of that. Scuttling would have to involve a sledgehammer to pound away at valves down in the bottom of the ship to open her up to the water. No real provision was given for quickly destroying classified documents either. Captain Bucher had to spend money meant for crew amenities on the most basic of incinerators. But worst of all were her defences. A pair of 50 caliber machine guns were provided, with fore and aft deck mounts, totally exposed. They were enough to ward off a small patrol craft, but the bridge and the critical communications officers were left completely unarmoured. In the course of their training, some of the ship's crew fired just 5 rounds from the machine guns each. So it was that Pueblo set out as an AGER, Auxiliary General Environmental Research, ostensibly to monitor the ocean and its conditions, but in reality, a signals surveillance vessel. The AGER ships, like Pueblo, were tiny in comparison to other surveillance vessels like the AGTRs, employing about 1/4 the intelligence personnel of the larger vessels. But they were fast, nimble, and most importantly of all, they were cheap. Pueblo set off for the Korean Peninsula, where it was thought US signals intelligence was most lacking. From the off, Pueblo was not a happy ship. Bucher butted heads with his XO, who thought the captain was too easygoing. The situation devolved to the point where Bucher would ignore his XO and go straight to his operations officer instead. Not only that, but tensions built up between the skipper and the head of the signals detachment on board, who needed to give permission for his men to be used for anything like firefighting, damage control, or even to set up watches. For an autonomous sub-commander like Bucher, this command structure, having to ask for permission, was incredibly frustrating. Nearly half of Pueblo's crew had no experience at sea at all. In November 1967, Pueblo set out for Yokosuka, Japan via Hawaii. On the way, she suffered some 60 steering malfunctions in just 8 days. While the ship was being repaired at Pearl Harbor, Captain Bucher met with the top brass of the Pacific Fleet staff, who told him in no uncertain terms that if the little ship were attacked on their mission, there was nothing that could be done. En route to Japan, the ship was rocked by huge waves, even rolling up to 50 degrees from side to side, before her steering engine gave out completely. In for repairs yet again, Bucher raised concerns with the scuttling solution for his ship. The proposed solution, thermite charges that would essentially melt through the delicate equipment and then the ship itself, was rejected by the captain. "I was just too afraid to put it on there," he said. At last, Pueblo had her sailing orders to leave base on January 5th and proceed to an operational area a few days later on the 10th through the Strait of Tsushima and monitor communications of Chongjin, Hamhung, and Wonsan, maintaining a distance of no less than 13 nautical miles from the coast. "I was proud of this ship," said Commander Bucher, "and I was ready to go. I wanted to get out there and get this job on the road so that we could get this experience behind us." Underway at last, after years of preparation and months of conversion work, Pueblo was finally off on her mission. Admiral Frank Johnson, commander of Navy Forces Japan, said that, quote, "I personally made the initial determination that risk would be minimal, since Pueblo would be operating in international waters during the entire operation. Specifically, in evaluating the risk, 3 key factors weighed heavily in the final decision. 1. Pueblo operates throughout the mission in international waters. 2. Low level of Korean naval activity at sea in January and February. And 3. The complete lack of any North Korean reaction to the USS Banner's presence off North Korean coast on 2 occasions, one of which it loitered off Wonsan for about 1.5 days. Secretly though, the NSA had concerns of a Korean response to Pueblo's presence offshore. They decided against informing the Navy because senior NSA officials were afraid the agency would be seen to be overstepping. A weak warning message was sent highlighting signs of North Korean aggression and possible response, but it was ignored by the Navy officials. Pueblo, unprepared, tense, and vulnerable, was motoring straight into disaster. Hugging the coast to avoid visual detection by nearby Soviet ships, Pueblo entered the Sea of Japan on January 12th, where she was immediately met with a monster storm that kept her tied up for 2 days. Finally, on station, Bucher reiterated their orders not to approach shore within 13 miles. During daylight, Pueblo would hover around 14 or 15 miles offshore, while at nightfall she'd motor out in excess of 30, just in case. It was not a happy patrol. 2 generators blew up, and frigid temperatures blasted the ship, coating her in ice up to 2 inches thick. The crew, of course, had to chip it all off, especially from the specialised antennas and the equipment up top. "We had trouble with water all the time," said one mate. "The bilge pump was backing up or something, and I'd wake up in the morning sometimes and find everything floating around the deck." Ostensibly, the intelligence detachment aboard comprised of 4 Morse code interceptors in the collection branch, 12 in the technical branch who handled intercepts of non-Morse communications, and 5 translators in the intercept branch should have been having a field day collecting information from North Korean air assets and warships like guided missile boats. But in the event, communication was slow and little was intercepted at all. Then, the technical branch found their support documentation was outdated. That, and they had poor training to begin with. The intercept branch's translators actually knew very little Korean. The mission was shaping up to be a bust, but in the evening of the 20th of January, the little ship's crew had a start when an unfamiliar boat passed close by. Just 4,000 yards, around 3.4 kilometers away, motored a North Korean SO-1 subchaser. But being so far offshore and not engaging in any outwardly hostile acts, the boat ignored Pueblo, so she continued on with her task. 2 days later, though, on the 22nd, things became downright concerning. 2 bigger ships, North Korean trawlers, appeared on the horizon and beared down on the little Pueblo, buzzing her close by. She was detected at last. That night, around 3 a.m, a bright orange flare lit up the horizon. Some 18 different ships now floated around Pueblo. Attempts to transmit a message informing naval planners of the situation were unsuccessful, and Pueblo was on her own. What the crew of Pueblo didn't know is that they'd been tracked for about a day by shore-based North Korean radar stations and from MiG jets above. Mid-morning, on the 23rd, North Korean radio chatter began to refer to Pueblo as an enemy ship. At lunchtime, those on watch spotted another SO-1 subchaser, this time equipped with fire control radar, and it was approaching quickly. The crew quickly began to collect samples from the water under their environmental research guise, but the subchaser wasn't fooled. It was impossible to ignore the vast array of antennas atop the little ship. It signaled a simple warning: heave to, or I will open fire. This presented Commander Buka with a conundrum. Other surveillance vessels had been harassed and chased out of their area of operations, but now other vessels began to approach Pueblo too. 4 torpedo boats surrounded her, while overhead, a pair of MiGs roared through the sky. One of the boats approached with armed men at the ready on deck. Clearly, they intended to actually board Pueblo. Buka ordered his engines full ahead, and a course steered for open water. His signalmen sent a semaphore message thanking the North Koreans for their hospitality, but the grey boats remained ominously silent. They wouldn't let her go. As Pueblo tried to speed away from the scene, the torpedo boats came up alongside, overtook, and began to cross dangerously in front of her bows. "Heave to, or I will open fire," one of the bigger ships signalled again. Buka thought it was a bluff. They were in international waters. An open act of hostility out here could risk another war. Even more ominously though, the small torpedo boats that had surrounded his ship now began to slowly peel off and maintain a wider distance. Worse still, the formation of boats close around Pueblo was forcing her further south with nowhere to turn, running her closer and closer to the Korean mainland. Then, it happened. One of the boats fired its guns straight at Pueblo, while from the smaller PT boats, machine gun fire chattered away and raked her hull from stem to stern. Shrapnel burst all around as Buka and the others hit the deck. He must have been all too familiar with the fact his bridge was unarmoured. To his horror, the Korean boats were targeting the bridge specifically. As command centre of the ship, it offered a juicy target. 57mm rounds tore through the bridge screens while machine gun fire kept everybody's heads down. Clearly, the North Koreans didn't want Pueblo to scuttle, least of all escape. Down below though, the order had been given to destroy sensitive material. The incinerators got to work, but they just couldn't keep up with the sheer amount of paperwork needing destruction. The North Koreans saw smoke streaming from ventilators and hatchways, and they knew straight away what was happening. They had to stop the ship first chance. One of the subchasers closed to point-blank range and fired right into the ship's sides. Buka stared at his XO, slumped down on the deck, not responding, as shells tore into his ship all around him. One of the engineering officers roared at him, "Are you going to stop this goddamn ship before we're all killed?" Early February, and Reuters and other news services began to report on confessions being broadcast out of North Korea. The crew of an American ship held captive were now admitting to their misdeeds offshore. 2 weeks earlier, Commander Bucher had been frozen in a moment of indecision when his engineering officer rang down to stop the ship's engines. The firing had stopped, and Pueblo was ordered to follow the Korean ships closer to shore. But after a while, realizing they were soon to be captured, and with little of the sensitive material actually burned, Bucher ordered the engines stopped again to buy some time. The firing began at once. 2 salvos took the leg off one fireman, killing him, while badly wounding others. Pueblo had started up again before she was boarded by senior Korean officers who gazed wide-eyed at the bags of unburned military documents and complex machinery around them. The ship had been taken to Wonsan Harbor, her crew blindfolded and led away. At first, the North Koreans had a hard time telling officers apart from the other ranks because of their ragtag appearance, half of them dressed in wet weather gear and bedraggled uniforms. But soon enough, they zeroed in on their most important captures and got to work. Interrogation turned to torture. One officer was threatened with starvation and then execution. One interrogation session alone went for 19 hours. "They beat the hell out of me for 6 hours, said one Pueblo man, because I wouldn't admit that I spoke Korean. But some of the worst treatment was reserved for Commander Bucher. After a mock execution, deprived of sleep and food, and at last told that his men would be harmed or even killed, he was finally forced to sign and broadcast a confession. His, like the others, told a simple story, that Pueblo had been operating only a few miles out from the North Korean shore and not in international waters, thus justifying the attack. Bucher was forced to say that Pueblo's mission had been part of a new war of aggression against Asia, and that they'd fired on the North Korean patrol boats first. In Washington, there was a sense of abject disbelief, but slowly, as the details began to clarify, there came frantic, heated discussion. To overreact risked the hostages, 82 in total, being killed. Worse still, the threat of aggression might risk antagonizing the Soviets and the Chinese and lead to a broader conflict in Asia. Then, just a few days later, in Vietnam, the great North Vietnamese assault began, the Tet Offensive, that overshadowed the Pueblo incident and stretched planners' boundaries to the max. In summary, says a report, the North Korean seizure of the USS Pueblo threw the US government decision-making process into disarray. By the end of the week, it continued, the initial shock of the Pueblo's seizure had given way to a mood of depression and anger sparked by the futility of the situation. In the Sea of Japan, a mobilized US task force was tailed by Soviet surveillance aircraft. At a state of readiness for open conflict, the US force was soon tailed by some 13 Soviet surface warships. The mood was grim. Soon enough, the victorious North Koreans began broadcasting just what kind of treasure trove of sensitive information had been recovered from Pueblo, and it was obvious just how little had been destroyed by the crew. Press conferences with the senior officers from the ship involved carefully scripted responses. The propaganda machine was in full swing, but the Americans managed to get their own back. Posed photographs show them flipping the middle finger in an act of subtle defiance, something they told Korean captors was a kind of greeting back home. But as February dragged on, it became clear that Pueblo's capture wasn't likely to lead to all-out war. She was, after all, a tiny converted freighter, hardly a prestige asset, and the damage had already been done as far as capturing sensitive documents. Now all that remained was to get the crew back. The men had been taken immediately by train to a facility outside Pyongyang, where they were forced to fill out personal information forms. Those early rounds of interrogation were geared at obtaining information to be used in more intense sessions later. In the middle of the night, in March, all 82 men were driven 20 minutes down the road to another facility and housed 8 to a room. A doctor and a nurse remained on standby 24 hours a day to treat them, and even provided eyeglasses to those that needed them. But interrogation, however, was intense. Men were forced to crawl around wood-boarded floors on their knees, they were kicked, punched, and threatened with execution. The focus was on the officers, and the beatings could be severe. This went on for months, but the men maintained they never revealed any serious, sensitive information. While the US espionage community was seriously concerned with the leaking of secrets, the US Navy had completely different concerns. This was the first time since the War of 1812 that an American ship had been captured in combat. By November 1968, the crew had been held for nearing 10 months, and torturous negotiations were underway for their return. North Korea insisted that the US should admit to outright violation of their waterways and that they should apologize for these crimes first. After much back and forth, a compromise was settled on. The North Koreans would draft a document, an American senior representative in South Korea would sign it, but then publicly declare it in a formal statement to be false. At 9 a.m. on December 23rd, Major General Gilbert H. Woodward issued a statement rejecting the idea Pueblo had been engaged in illegal activity, and ended with the words, "I will sign the document to free the crew, and only to free the crew." With that, he signed his name to the North Korean statement. At 11:30 a.m., the Pueblo men emerged in the DMZ in single file, trudging over to the south side of the zone. Their ordeal had been extreme, but their time in the spotlight had also been short-lived. Just days after capture, the Tet Offensive had virtually wiped them from the headlines. But now, at least, they were free. With them, they carried the body of the fireman who'd been killed by the shelling. Thus began the long journey home, but it would happen quickly. They were aboard a plane bound for San Diego the very next day, arriving on Christmas Eve. But before they could savour being on US soil once more, they were called in for an urgent, hurried debrief while the memory in their heads was fresh and not confused. What followed was a host of inquiries, reports, and frantic damage assessment. It was clear that Pueblo was probably the biggest intelligence hit to the US in living memory by a wide margin. Despite all he'd been through, Bucher was suddenly confronted with a frightening prospect. A Navy inquiry found that he and another senior officer should be brought up for a court-martial for failure to resist the boarding, failure to destroy the classified documents, and for improper management of the ship and crew. It came down to Secretary of the Navy, John Chaffee, to step in and overrule the Chief of Naval Operations. He said, "I have reviewed the record of the Court of Inquiry and the recommendations of the convening authority and the Chief of Naval Operations. I make no judgment regarding the guilt or innocence of any of the officers of the offences alleged against them. I am convinced, however, that neither individual discipline nor the state of discipline or morale in the Navy, nor any other interest requires further legal proceedings with respect to any personnel involved in the Pueblo incident." In reviewing the court's recommendations, he continued, with respect to Commander Bucher, Lieutenant Murphy and Lieutenant Harris, it's my opinion that they've suffered enough and further punishment would not be justified. The major factor which led to the Pueblo's lonely confrontation by anticipatedly bold and hostile forces was the sudden collapse of a premise which had been assumed at every level of responsibility and upon which every other aspect of the mission had been based: freedom of the high seas. At that particular point in history, the common confidence in the historic inviolability of a sovereign ship on the high seas in peacetime was shown to have been misplaced. The consequences must, in fairness, be borne by all rather than by one or two individuals whom circumstances had placed closer to the crucial event. In light of the considerations set out above, I've determined that the charges against all of the officers concerned will be dismissed. As far as the Navy was concerned, that was it. The AGER program was wrapped up in 1969, and Pueblo's fleetmates were retired. As for her crew, even though they'd been kept in brutal circumstances for so long, the US government considered them instead as illegal detainees and not POWs. It wasn't until 1990 when they were at last awarded medals for their ordeal. Commander Bucher died in 2004 at 76, in part, some said, because of wounds sustained in action. But long afterward, Navy brass debated privately about his conduct, why he hadn't manned the 50 caliber guns or ordered some kind of stiff resistance. Admiral John Hyland, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet at the time, later said, "Of course, it's also clear in retrospect, there's no one smarter than a Monday morning quarterback. I guess we all tend now to tell Bucher what he should have done. When the Navy gives Guy command of the ship," he continued, "they don't know ahead of time how he's going to act in an emergency or in a time of war. You give command to the best people you have according to a lot of measuring sticks, and you expect that they'll perform when they're called upon. But many of the best skippers have never had anything go wrong. They perform very well and move right up in the Navy to become flag officers, but they've never had a combat situation. Still, when something does happen, you measure an officer's performance against the highest standards, and Bucher got a completely failing grade. Today, Bucher is largely thought of as a kind of scapegoat for the ordeal, but clearly his contemporaries thought very differently of him. Today, Pueblo is still kept by the North Koreans as a dual war trophy and tourist attraction. Visitors can tour the ship and explore crew quarters and the equipment rooms, which are still intact. Up on deck, battle damage can still be seen, but the US Navy has kept the ship on active commission and clearly states that it still remains United States property. This curious situation makes Pueblo the second longest commissioned warship currently afloat, next to USS Constitution. North Korea has actually recently suggested they'd be willing to repatriate the ship, but for the foreseeable future, she's likely to stay just where she is, a floating reminder of the Cold War's darkest days, when American naval and intelligence might was suddenly and unexpectedly challenged by a vastly inferior foe. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.